Welcome to another episode of the DSL podcast. I am your host, Dave Cole, and our guest today is Adam McElhinney. He comes to us from Paylocity. Adam, you are the Chief Data Science Officer and the VP of Data Insights at Paylocity. So first of all, what is Paylocity?
Thanks, Dave. Paylocity, we are a publicly traded software company. We make a class of software called HCM, or Human Capital Management Software. You can think of it as everything that you need to run an HR department. So payroll, benefits administration, but more and more we're really focused on employee engagement and productivity solutions.
Very, very cool. So as you might imagine, today our agenda, we're gonna start off talking a bit about people analytics, HR analytics, and clearly that's your wheelhouse at Paylocity. And I think it's sort of a universal use case and universal sort of opportunity for DSLs out there, because everybody has a people team, everybody has an HR team, and if you're looking for various ways as a data science leader in which you can help your company, I think HR is a great place to start. So we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about some of the use cases and some of the challenges, some of the data that you need to have, et cetera, in order to get those projects going. And then we're going to talk a little bit, segue briefly into the data science, the hiring process, and how data science can be used in the hiring process to improve that whole process. So that'll be an interesting topic. And then last but not least, Paylocity is a SaaS, software as a service company, and there is data science product within Paylocity. And I'd love to talk a little bit about just how to embed data science and analytics into a SaaS offering and a SaaS platform, and what are some of the tips and tricks and challenges. So does that sound good,
Sounds
Adam?
Great. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, first of all, what to you is people analytics, just talk to us at a high level, and then we'll sort of dive in.
Sure. I mean, the background of people analytics is pretty interesting. It's something that's been talked about for quite a while, but I think there's really been a shift in the landscape in the past, maybe 5 to 7 years. So a lot of the large tech companies like Google, Amazon, et cetera, really kind of went forward and public with some, pretty high profile and impressive people analytics initiatives that they have been doing internally for themselves. And that really started educating executives and HR professionals about kind of the value of people analytics. Of course, people have been using descriptive reporting for, obviously decades. But you're really starting to see a lot more kind of machine learning and predictive and prescriptive analytics being applied to the human resources landscape, as evidenced by kind of those FANG companies that I talked about. Now, what's been an interesting shift, though, is that started to come down market. So the way those large companies like Amazon and Google have done this is they have huge internal people analytics teams that they've spun up that roll up to HR and support these initiatives. But we've seen more kind of centralized data science teams at maybe smaller and mid-market type companies. They're still large companies, but not on the scale of a Google or an Amazon, spending some of their data science resources working on people analytics projects. And we've also seen a lot of software solutions start to embed more sophisticated people analytics into those tools for those people that just want to buy something off the shelf.
So let's start. So for the audience who may not be up to speed on people analytics, where did sort of Google start? I mean, do you know a little bit about the history there? You mentioned some of these larger companies, the FANG companies, actually creating analytics teams within HR departments or people teams. Can you give us a little bit about the history, the use case, and what they did?
Yeah, I mean, they've done a ton of research on studying what makes the most effective teams, studying characteristics of developers and seeing how that affects developer productivity, bug rates in the code, things like that. And they have such a large and well curated data set for that. They're really in kind of a unique position to do that. Amazon's very famously uses a lot of people analytics for predicting headcount requirements, figuring out how many people they're going to need in the distribution centers, what percentage of people are going to show up sick on a given day. So, if you think you need 100 people, but you know that 5 people are probably going to show up sick, okay, well, maybe I want to staff 105 people. and really
Right.
helping like optimize their labor force through the use of people analytics.
Yeah. I think, well, if I'm out there right now, I might think to myself, do I have the amount of like data to actually, um, you know, use data science to move the needle? I mean, do I have to be, a 100,000 person plus company or something along those lines, or can I work with if I'm a company of 1,000, right, or even 5,000? Like, do I still need people analytics? And like, so talk to us a little bit about like what data do you think is important to build out some of these capabilities?
Sure. So, I mean, regarding sample sizes, regardless of the size of the company, I really recommend everybody start with just some basic descriptive statistics. And, provided you have even like a couple hundred employees, like you'll probably find some value there, particularly once you start stitching kind of all the data sources together. So some of the main data sources that you'll find, kind of the most important data set is kind of typically it's kind of the employee data set. In the HCM world, this is sometimes called like the HRIS, like the Human Resources Information System. So this is obviously things like people's names, demographic information, job title, salary or hourly rate, supervisor department, all the types of attributes that you would assume to have about an employee.
Right.
Other important data sets are typically your recruiting data set. So that's where you have kind of all the candidate information, and then you typically have, what were the contacts that were made with the candidate, what's the funnel that was set up for recruiting, how far did this candidate make it in the funnel. That's usually pretty useful. Another useful data set is typically employee performance data. This one, depending on the nature of the job and the company, can be pretty subjective and sometimes pretty dirty and require quite a bit of cleaning.
Yeah.
But most companies do some type of periodic performance review, feedback process, maybe yearly, twice yearly, something like that. That's another very powerful data set. Other data sets are really around employee engagement. That's typically measured via like a large annual survey. And many times it's anonymized, sometimes it's not anonymized.
Right.
And then any other periodic kind of pulse or engagement surveys that your team might be sending. Best practice really there is, instead of doing kind of one big yearly surveys, to do much smaller periodic surveys so you can collect and trend that data over time. So those are a lot of like the main data sets that you'll have. And then any exit interview and turnover data as well is another typically very valuable data set. So how those are all stored, how easy it is to get them into a single place and join them together for analysis kind of depends on how you set up your infrastructure. But those are typically the main data sets that you're interested in.
Yeah, Adam, one data set, maybe it was unintentional that I didn't hear you mention is pay. That is near and dear to many people's hearts. I imagine that's also, probably tied to the performance data as well, right?
Yeah, compensation data is definitely important. When we look at like what are the factors that drive people to leave a company, we definitely see being paid under market as a factor that's positively associated with people leaving.
Right.
There's been some conflicting research on this. Other third-party research has said that pay isn't a super strong predictor. Now, I think a lot of this gets nuanced based on what type of roles you're talking about and how are you defining pay. But that's certainly compensation certainly is an important data set to look at.
Right, and certainly in the news. I mean, just in general in society, there's been a lot of talk of equitable pay, right? So for the
Yep.
same role and the same amount of tenure, same experience, making sure that pay is equitable, and that's certainly like something that an analytics team can be helpful with. But yeah, I mean, in terms of what are those, you mentioned what are some of the leading indicators for why employees leave? I imagine that's another big use case, right? Is looking at employee turnover and employee churn. I've always heard, you don't leave, companies. What is it? You leave companies.
You leave
Um,
bosses and not
because
companies.
your managers, right? Not companies. Yeah, you
Yep.
leave your bosses and not companies. So things like I don't know if that's true or not, but hey, maybe you have more information, and is that apocryphal or is that like more of a true adage? I don't know if you have any evidence
Yeah,
on
we,
that.
we definitely see evidence of that. One of the use cases that my team works on a lot is a retention risk dashboard for our customers that shows these are the employees that are most likely to leave your company. And then we try to surface up like what are the risk factors that make somebody at risk for attrition so that you can take some type of preventative action to keep them from staying. Some of the top risk factors that we see are things that intuitively make a lot of sense. So one thing we see that is attrition like begets more attrition. So
Yeah.
if you're in a high period of attrition overall, like that's going to be a leading indicator that you're going to have more attrition in the future, which is not surprising. But we do see typically tend to see pockets of attrition. So we'll see a certain manager or a certain department, they'll tend to kind of spike together, whether that's being driven by some change in the organization or maybe not a particularly effective manager or department. It's difficult to say without more anecdotal data, but that's something we definitely see. We see people that are paid lower relative to the median for their role are more likely to leave. We see tenure-related effects. So
Hmm.
kind of
Hmm.
unsurprisingly, and this varies a lot based on whether it's an hourly role versus a salary role, based on the industry, level of experience, et cetera. But typically you see some type of bathtub curve where, there's some people in the first 3 to 6 months that just aren't going to make it, or they decide the job isn't for them. And then attrition tends to flatten out. And then after some period of time, you'll start to see it slowly increase a little bit. And again, what that duration looks like varies a lot, as you might suspect in more entry level or hourly positions. It's going to be a lot shorter window. For salaried professional positions, that window could be decades.
Yeah. I'm curious. Let's say the data is clearly showing that a manager has high attrition. Like in your role and in your experience, like there's some tough conversations to be had. I imagine like what you're doing is you're really arming the people team, the HR team, use those terms interchangeably, to go and have those conversations, which often can be very very tough. I mean, the reason that you might have high turnover in a particular department certainly might be due to the department head not being a great manager, or it could just be for other reasons. Maybe that manager just has a very high bar, and like that's the expectation is that if you don't meet that bar, I'm gonna go out and look for somebody who's better, or who knows what, right? And maybe they're performing at a high level. Like all these things, they're very nuanced and tough conversations.
Yep.
Is that how you see it, or does it or no? Like does the data science team play a different role?
No, you're absolutely right. So my advice to anybody getting started with people analytics is you need to approach all of these use cases with a very high degree of humility, and you need to surface up conversations and data points that kick off like much larger discussions, right? So
Right, right,
sure, like we can run some descriptive statistics and look at like turnover rate by a given manager, but you very much just cannot blindly say like, oh, Adam's team is a higher turnover rate than Dave's team, therefore Adam's doing a worse job. I mean, there's so much nuance,
right.
so much interpretation there. So what we really advise people and what we really advise our customers to do, and we try to bake that into the product. And this is the same advice if you're doing people analytics yourself, which I suspect a lot of the audience will. You really just need to like put out this data out there and then say, okay, like what do we think's going on here? Really don't. I strongly discourage you from leading with conclusions, right? Leading with saying
Yeah,
like, oh, the turnover rate in this department's unacceptable. You really got to approach this with a high degree of humility. We're all statisticians. We all know correlation doesn't equal causation, and we all know that there's these machine learning algorithms. They're just fitting functions to data points, and so there's a lot of interpretation and subjectivity here. So approach this with a high degree of humility, and make sure you're involving the subject matter experts early and just using this to facilitate discussion.
right. And what do you segue a little bit here? I mean, you mentioned Google sort of looking at performance and looking at the number of bugs that maybe the developers have created as sort of some indicator of performance. Have you also looked into like seeing an HR function looking into productivity, so helping the other areas of the business be smarter and actually be better? So see as sort of an enablement capability to some of the other departments.
Yeah, productivity is really tough to measure. In the data sets that we look at, we don't have access to financial data or anything like that. But we do have access to turnover data and headcount
Mm-hmm.
growth and kind of employee sentiment and satisfaction. Um, And so measuring productivity is really difficult. So in the Google example, because they have such a large sample size of software engineers, and there's kind of a defined target variable there. Like you can look at number of bugs that were introduced by somebody, number of lines of codes written. And again, there's, as the developers listening to this will know, there's still a bunch of caveats with that. And that's kind of like a
Totally.
best case example.
Right.
Sales was another example where like maybe you can kind of have something of an objective target variable there. You have like dollars of revenue they brought in, but even still, there can be differences in territories people are assigned or certain products that people are assigned. So even that's tough. But developing that objective measure of performance is extremely, extremely difficult in practice.
Yeah, I
But
know.
when we
The
look,
world of sorry, I was just getting like the world of like sale, like looking at what makes a great account executive or a great salesperson. I mean, looking at like how many meetings they have, right? How many
yep,
conversations they have, time to close. Obviously, you look at the amount of revenue they bring in, but it's like what data can you potentially look at that sort of is the predecessor to those outcomes, to landing an opportunity, and it's hard. I mean, you know meetings, how good are the meetings, how
yep,
there's
yep,
all, there's all sorts of qualitative aspects of it, but I think some of it can be extremely helpful, right? I mean, I know, if you're a salesperson out there and you're not having much in the way of any meetings, that's a leading indicator that like probably your quarter's not going to be very good, right? If you're not having lots of meetings, most likely, right? You're not having those conversations. So there's like some things that like at least as you mentioned can start the conversation, and can help you be a little bit more curious about what's going on. But
yep.
I imagine there's also a risk of like being a little bit of sort of big brothery, right? Like, oh man, the people team is really analyzing things all over the place. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever gotten pushback along those lines.
Oh yeah, definitely. So whenever you're doing HR analytics, there's huge ethical and privacy considerations. So for our own internal usage at Paylocity, for example, we actually have a whole AI ethics committee that has a statement of ethics. We have every project goes through an ethics scorecard that we've developed, and depending on the nature of the project, there's certain like remediation steps and documentation that have to be filled out. And then we periodically read out, the ethics committee reads out to Paylocity's broader D&I initiative, and we publish our ethics risk assessments for anyone in product and technology to read and review and push back on. And we're constantly tweaking that. And we're also partnering with our director of data privacy and our AppSec and InfoSec teams. So that's hugely, hugely, hugely important whenever you're doing any of these HR initiatives. You really have to give a lot of thought into that. And like you said, there's the big brother aspect, there's legal aspects, there's fairness aspects, there's ethical aspects, and you're dealing with some of the most sensitive data that you can ever have about a given human being. So you really need to tread carefully there and give some thought into that before you kick off any of these initiatives.
So we're stumbling upon this is not on the agenda, but this is a big topic, which is ethics and data science, right?
Yep.
Bias, all these other things. What sort of advice? I mean, you clearly have at Paylocity a well-established, it sounds to me, a well-established process and approach. What sort of advice do you have for the DSLs out there who might be, going down the path of some building models that might have impact from an ethics standpoint, and might be worried about D&I and bias and gender and ethnicity and so on and so forth? Like what sort of approach would you recommend they take?
Yeah, there's a few tips that I think we've learned. So first is you really need to think through these considerations, independent of any projects, and you need to really outline that framework ahead of time. So, once you're halfway through a project, if that's when you start considering things, a lot of us, it's easy to get trapped into that kind of sunk cost fallacy, or like the team's motivated about the project, they've already spent time on it, and they'll just see this as like an impediment, or they're just excited about the momentum that they have. We're data scientists, we love building models, we love crunching numbers, and these type of paperwork stuff, sometimes that feels less important. So I recommend you really need to do this work ahead of time. There's a lot of really good third-party research out there. If you do your homework on this, I don't think you have to reinvent the wheel, and I think you should leverage third-party research. But I do think you should spend some time to figure out, which research is most applicable for your situation, and kind of bring that into your grounding. Hospitals, they have these like medical ethics committees or these ethics oversight boards. We've kind of modeled our AI ethics practices off that, and we found that to be useful. So that way, it's not people's full-time jobs, but it's something they're held accountable for, and it does create somewhat of an arm's length distance from the project team. And the people reviewing the ethics assessment aren't on the project team. So having some amount of arm's length distance from there makes a lot of sense. And also, this really can't be a data science only initiative. You need to bring in outside people who have a vested interest, and they might not be data scientists or be technical, but that's fine. That's exactly the point. Like, you need to bring in different viewpoints as part of this process as well. And then I recommend being very, very open with your assessments and saying, here's where we think the risk is, here's what we're doing to mitigate it, allowing people to view it or debate it if they push back. What we learned when we went through our process, there really is not, it's not cut and dry. Like, it's all shades of gray. It's all shades of gray. And so just being very explicit about, what are the risky areas and what you can do to mitigate those is the approach that we've found works the best. And we're constantly evolving. As every quarter, the ethics committee sets quarterly goals for things that they want to change, improvements they want to make, and we just keep iterating. And then the last piece of advice, there needs to be like a substantial training component as well. So we do an annual training for all employees, and then there's a special training for new hires on AI ethics and our best practices there.
That's great. I think a lot of good nuggets in there. I certainly think having a committee that is not part of the project itself, but as that sort of that arm's length and enough separated to be able to ask questions and be able to question the approach, question the data sets that you're using, and maybe even question the project at all. Like, should it even be embarked upon? So I think that's all really good advice, and I think hopefully there's some easy to find third-party resources, like you said, that are out there for the folks who are listening. I do want to segue into we talk a lot on the DSL podcast about sort of the challenge of hiring data scientists, and just the challenge of so there's sort of two aspects of it. First of all, I'm curious to know how you hire into your team, Adam. And then secondly, I'm also interested in how data science can be used to improve the hiring process. So there's sort of both aspects, right? So take whichever one and dive into. Maybe start with what sort of approach do you take to hiring out your team?
Sure. So our hiring process is probably pretty similar to most companies. We have an internal wiki page where we kind of specify these are the qualifications and types of candidates we're looking for. And we really try to write everything down so that it's clear, people can debate it, people can say, I don't think this is reasonable, or this potentially is unfair, or something like that. So we have that all that documented. Then we have a recruiter phone screen, and then a phone screen of somebody from data science. And then if somebody at that point wants to move forward, we ask them that they complete a case study for us. It can be done on their own time. They tell us when they want to do it. We send them the materials, and they send it back to us. And that's really meant to mirror what they would actually do in the day-to-day job. So it's a very realistic scenario. It's obviously scaled down because of just time requirements and stuff like that. And then they have two main outputs. So one output is a business presentation that they would present to a non-technical audience. And then the second is kind of their code and models. We do have kind of like a Kaggle-like holdout data set that they give, and then we have scripts that kind of score them. But honestly, that's probably the least important part of the process.
That's interesting.
So if they agree to do that, and it is a time commitment from them. If they agree to do that, then we promise them that they'll get a final round interview with us, and then we'll give them a decision within a week. So what we think is kind of a fair bargain. Like they're going to give us some time. They're going to get a guaranteed final round interview, and then we'll give them kind of a yes or no in a week, so they can, just know and get the return from their investment in time. So what that final round interview looks like, the first part of that is them presenting that business case study that we talked about. They present that to a data science manager, and they also present it to a product owner from Paylocity. The reason we do that is our data science model, it's a centralized model, but we embed into other teams. So the data scientists will embed into these teams kind of at the service of the product owner, with the goal of productionalizing machine learning enabled features that live in those products. So the first part of that presentation is really focused on, can this person work with a product owner? Can they translate between business requirements and technical requirements? Can they translate model outputs back into business impact? Can they kind of produce useful insights from the data that a product owner would find interesting? And then the second part of the interview is they meet with a data science manager and another data scientist, and then they go really deep into the technical aspects. So they're actually looking at the code, looking at the modeling. How did you deal with missing data? How did you deal with dirty data? What are the models
Right.
used? How you validated those models? All of that type of stuff. Is the code clean? Is it not clean? Stuff like that. And then the last interview is an interview to see if there's an alignment with our culture and values. So that's much more of a behavioral focused interview. And we have a great team that runs that.
I think
And
that's sorry, I was just gonna, this is a phenomenal blueprint. I mean, I'm nodding my head as you're talking here. I think you're hitting it. You're evaluating the candidates on your team, the data scientists, on their technical acumen, on their ability to work with their future manager, it might be a DSM, a data science manager. You're also evaluating them on their ability to work and present sort of business outcomes and work with the product owners. I think the embedded model we talk a lot on the DSL podcast. I'm curious, are those the data scientists solid lined into you, so they're reporting into your team? You're nodding your head. Yes. Okay. Cool.
Yep.
And then they're sort of dotted lined, I guess, into the various embedded business units. Is that basically how it works? Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of conversation too, like how business savvy should the data scientist be versus like that sort of nice blend of being able to present your work and making it relatable to somebody who may not be steeped in statistics or machine learning. Versus just being like an expert and like an expert in deep learning or what have you, in something highly technical. And I think clearly you're hiring for that mix, right? And some companies out there have said, you know what, not every data scientist is going to be able to clearly be able to describe business outcomes. They might be great at building models, and sometimes they create like an engagement manager type role, or even like a data science product manager, right, who can work as translator. But you're looking for the combination, and I think obviously both models work, but there's one less person in your model for sure, and that's great.
Yeah, I think a lot of that decision comes down to the size of the team, the maturity with respect to data science, and the breadth of use cases that you're working on. So if you, for example, like let's say you're a company, I don't know, you do mortgage issuance. I'm just coming up with something that's
Sure.
at the top of my head, right? And you need to build that mortgage default model, right? Like that might be an area where like you really don't need a super, you don't need all your team to be super business focused, because you probably need a core group of data scientists who are just going to crank on that model every month, incorporate new data sources, shave off the prediction error, and like it's well understood how that fits into the rest of the business, what the business impact of an improvement in the model performance is. That's an aspect where I think you're totally right. Where we're at a point at Paylocity where we're seeking to embed machine learning into every product that we have, and a lot of times we're entering a new product for the first time. So there's a fair amount of work in understanding the product. There'll be a number of possible use cases, figuring out which ones are feasible, which ones are going to have high business value, and then helping kind of translate from like what that product owner wants to achieve with their product to like how data science and machine learning can help. And so that's why we're where we are at in our current maturity level. We kind of need more of those generalists, but as we expect to grow, I definitely plan to hire more specialists. I foresee us hiring a natural language processing specialist. I foresee us hiring like a survey design and survey analysis specialist. So I think it's kind of a function of size and maturity and breadth of use cases.
Makes total sense. I think if you have if you know what your business outcome is going to be, and you're just working on improving say the accuracy of your model, and you're using additional data sources, maybe different types of algorithms to approach that. Like maybe you don't need the most business savvy data science team, but I think like if you're more in that creative problem solving type mode, and like each month comes with a new set of challenges, then yeah, you need to sort of weight more heavily on the more well-rounded data scientists. But I think, as you said, as you grow, there might be changes that are needed
Yep.
too. So
And jumping back to the interview process, I'm
yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to
that's
cut
what
you
I was
off
going to go
there.
next. Yeah, thanks. No, you're doing my job. Go for it.
Jumping back to that, I mean, we tried to mirror the interview process as to what their day to day would look like. And,
Yeah.
I want a candidate to leave the interview process and say, I really understand what I'd be doing there on a day to day.
Yeah.
And they can decide that's for me, or like, no, it's not for me. And that's totally fine either way. But I want them to leave feeling like, hey, this was a good experience. I have a lot of clarity into what I'm going to be doing. And then, if somebody doesn't want that focus or that kind of business aspect, that's totally fine. And they can decide, hey, I get it. I understand what they're looking for. That's just not what I want to do. I just want to like try out fancy new machine learning techniques and lower prediction error, work on model version 20 or something like that.
Right.
And that's
right.
just not what we're looking for right now.
Yeah. Well, the second part of my original question was talking a little bit about applying data science to the hiring process, not just for your team, I imagine, but for the wider the wider team, right? So for companies themselves to look at like what makes up a great hiring process. And I imagine most managers want to have like their own process that they've used in the past. And I'm curious, like, what are some like nuggets or interesting things that maybe data sets that you have used to evaluate like the whole recruiting process?
Yeah, this is really, really tricky. It can get unintentionally very ethically fraught, right? So,
Yes.
if you're to say, okay, how can we use data science to improve the hiring process? Where like something that might pop in your head is like, okay, let's build a machine learning model that figures out like who is a successful candidate and who's not a successful candidate. And you'll quickly get into like a couple different problems. So like one problem is like defining like what a successful candidate even means is very difficult. Is it somebody who got an offer? Is it somebody who made it to a final round interview? Is it somebody who got an offer and accepted an offer? Is it somebody who was a successful employee for 6 months or 1 year? So just even defining that, it's like very, very difficult. Second, like unless you're a really huge company, you'll probably run into like a sample size issue. This particularly for a given position, right? So you probably need some amount of sample size for a given position, and the interview processes are probably different for different positions, so you'll run into that. And then one of the biggest issues is there's a huge risk of unintended bias, not statistical bias, but like ethical bias, like creeping into those models, right? So you don't know, like it might learn that people who are on the lacrosse team are great candidates, and that could just be totally unrelated to the job, and it just happens to be that's who they've hired, or it's reinforcing some existing prejudice or bias in the hiring process. So it's really, really difficult. So we actually very purposely don't have that in any of our products, and we don't do that internally. Now, some of the more interesting stuff that I've seen companies do is use data science for masking and extracting data. So instead of a recruiter reading a resume that has a bunch of information like names or organizations from which you could kind of determine potentially somebody's demographics, can you use data science to identify those and kind of obfuscate those in such a way that you have more of a blind assessment of the candidate based on their actual qualifications? That's something that's very, very promising and that we're really excited about. And then I think just basic descriptive reporting here is still really important. So like how many people came into the funnel, how many people made it to stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, where are you losing people, and then slice and dice by various factors to, again, just to start conversations and say, hey, you know what, we're losing this type of person at step 2 of our funnel. Again, just start a conversation with there, assume
Yeah.
humility, and say like what do we think's going on there, and is there an opportunity for us to iterate on that?
That's great. I think I would absolutely, as a manager, I would absolutely purchase something that would allow me to my team to sort of mask resumes. I mean, there's been a lot of press on that in terms of sort of, it might be unintentional bias, but a bias that sort of creeps in
Yep.
just looking at the name, right? And
Yep.
just so I think that's not an easy problem. Like, it sounds easy, but it can be very difficult
Yeah.
to do it right. So um,
Absolutely. You might think like, oh, I'll start with the name, but then
right,
you might want to then mask address or location, or then
yeah,
college, or then various organizations and activities, and as you can imagine, there's like a very long tail of
yeah,
these,
oh yeah,
huge different number
yeah.
of formats. So
And you
yeah,
can't
yeah,
mask it so much so that you're like, okay, I have no idea what this person did.
exactly. Yep, yep, yep,
Right?
yep, yep.
Yeah. So yeah, it's again, it's sort of a tightrope walk that you have to walk. So that's fascinating. Well, last agenda topic, look, Paylocity is a SaaS platform, and your team is also embedding data science into the platform itself. I want to talk briefly about just some of the advice you have for others out there who are also maybe DSLs for SaaS companies, and what to sort of be aware of as they put their models into production.
Sure. So, I mean, with respect to productionalization, there's kind of 4 patterns that I think everything falls into. So, and they're kind of in ascending order of implementation difficulty in my mind. So the first is kind of just like the one-time analysis, right? This might be just like a strategic analysis that you're doing for somebody, maybe in how to reduce customer churn, just as an example or something like that. And your deliverable is going to be some type of like research or report. In which case, like, that's fine. Like, your code can kind of just run on one person's machine. It doesn't have to be super well documented. There isn't a whole lot of like productionalization there. I still would encourage you to follow best practices with respect to code reviews, and I still would encourage you to make sure that somebody else has tried to run this code and replicate it, in case like you want to revisit it in the future, or somebody's on vacation, you need to extend or change something about the analysis. But there's not a whole lot of productionalization that you're doing there.
Yep.
Second is like a batch productionalization. So this, if this is, you can really use this for, any model that maybe doesn't need to update more than once an hour. So if, something
Mm-hmm.
that you need to update, call it once an hour or greater, once an hour, once a day, once a week, once a month, something like that. We've, in a lot of HR use cases, HR data doesn't move super quickly. Depending on what you're doing, but typically, most people's characteristics aren't changing too quickly, or the data's not changing too fast. So a batch productionalization can do a lot. And so, like, we've invested in building out paved road deployment patterns for all these. So it's a combination of documentation plus code plus procedures and educations to do a batch productionalization, as an example. And it's very tightly linked to our infrastructure and our environments, and that's something like companies have to, very much modify for their type of infrastructure and environment. The third is, really like an API-based productionalization. That's very useful where you need something that updates more frequently, and maybe there's multiple applications that want this information, so they can just submit an API request and say, hey, like, run the model, or score this particular data set and get a result back. Again, there's a lot of good tools and like scaffolding that you can find in just the public research. But we're working on, that's another area we're working on, really fleshing out our paved road for that one a lot more and making that
Mm-hmm.
really clear. There's just a whole lot of, when you start to do things like that, there's a whole lot of things that a typical data scientist wouldn't think about, like logging, error handling. What happens if this thing
Yeah.
breaks at 2 a.m.? Is like the data scientist getting a call, or like who's getting a call? Like, what does that support and
On that
escalation
one,
look like?
I'm curious. Do you have a separate role for that? Because yeah, your data scientist is great at building models, and also your team is great at talking to and driving business outcomes with your business counterparts. But when it comes to, hey, can this API handle 10,000 requests per minute, or what have you? Like, sometimes that could be a different skill set. Do you have like a machine learning engineer or some title along those lines, or is the expectation that your team is able to sort of figure that out?
Yeah, we don't have that role. The expectation is the team can figure that out, and we try to give them as much scaffolding and guidance on that as
Right.
possible. And then we follow just kind of our general escalation procedures that we use across all of product and technology for dealing with those issues. But we want the team that built the models to own the code and own the productionalization. I'm a little skeptical of like the machine learning engineer role for most use cases,
Hmm.
unless like you get really big or have like really some specialized deployment patterns, because I think A, it can become a bottleneck. B, there can just be incentives to just like throw something over the wall that maybe isn't in a good spot. C, in the process of doing hardening and productionalization, I actually think you learn a lot that informs how you do the whole data science life cycle. Like, okay, can I functionalize this data cleaning thing that originally was just like some ad hoc script that I ran? Or,
Hmm.
hey, do you know what? We actually don't have great documentation for what we're doing here. Or can I abstract this piece of code out? Hey, this code's actually could be useful for 3 or 4 projects. Right now, it's just kind of in some model training script. Can I actually abstract that out and harden it and develop unit tests around it? So, but I think for some specialized use cases, the machine learning engineer route makes a lot of sense, but that's even harder to hire for than a traditional data scientist. So,
Yeah.
even if you want to go that route, it introduces a whole other set of challenges.
Sure. Sure.
Um, I do think the last kind of use case in my mind is the streaming use case where you need true streaming model deployment. I come before my current role, I was in IoT for a number of years, and that was an area we were looking for. From the time a piece of data was captured on a machine, we were looking to have the model pipelines run, the model execution happen, and a result to get back in about like 20 milliseconds. And it was a
Wow.
true streaming based architecture. And that's something where I think like a machine learning engineer role makes a lot more sense, because that is quite a bit higher of a deployment hurdle. And in that scenario, you really want to invest in like a lot of very high quality tooling for that type of deployment. But that really is a minority of use cases for most types of typical businesses.
Got it. Well, Adam, this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot. We covered a broad swath of sort of topics, talking about the hiring process, your hiring process. We even dove in a bit into ethics, and we started, of course, with people analytics, which I think, if you're a DSL out there, take a hard look at what your HR team is doing today, and maybe even offer up your services. I think it's a great. It's something that more companies need to do. I think when we talk about ethics and bias, we're not just talking about in data science. We're not just talking about the art of doing data science at all, but I think also data science can be helpful in uncovering biases and hopefully just helping out your people team be better, be more proficient, and be more, I don't know, ethical, I guess, for lack of a better term, in that hiring process. And I think it's super fascinating. It's super interesting. If people want to find out more and talk to you more, Adam, can they reach out to you on LinkedIn, or do you have any other
Absolutely.
social media? Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
LinkedIn's the best place to get a hold of
LinkedIn's the
me.
best place. Awesome. Well, Adam, this has been great. Thank you so much for joining the
My
DSL
pleasure.
podcast. Really
Thank
appreciate
you
it.
so much.
Take care.